And the mayor, she got elected last year.
No, this year, earlier this year.
Of this year. It seems to me she got a lot of money from big business. She got money from the police unions, all these same folks you're talking about. And she has, I would say, been saying words that sound good, but not actually doing anything to rein in the police department, to talk, at this town hall the other night. Sounded to me like a lot of lip service coming out of her mouth. What are the protest movement's thoughts on what this mayor has been doing or not doing?
I mean, she has a great coach. Her new husband is a former newscaster for the local media. So she has her talking points. I'm pretty sure she goes over communications every day. But the impact of her words, when you really start to tussle with her and really agitate her, you can see it. And so it's arrogance. So when people are angry, she said, "Oh, I'm glad for the enthusiasm." So that's the breakdown of really her racism. So she's willing to be coached up until it agitates her. So when someone says, "What are you going to do about Chief O'Toole in Lakeshore and Seagulls, the notorious racist and police officers?" She breaks down and say, "What do you want me to do?" When we talk about policy around training and de-escalation, she has a good talking point where we should look into that. But she never gives a timeline. And so she said, "Well, we looked into body cameras." But I've never really looked to it. But she's been an older person before. And so almost in the same way that we talk about Hillary in the 2016 campaign, being a career politician or being around politics, you should have some foresight. If you want to represent majority black cities and towns and districts, you should have some foresight into our problems around poverty, crime, and definitely police brutality.
And it also seems to me on the national level, obviously there's been hurricanes, there's been a terrible mass shooting, Trump's president, so every day is another chaotic situation. But it seems to me, I don't know, usually if protests are going on for 30 days, if you got thousands of people out on the streets, if you got brutality going on, you would think that would make it on CNN, more New York Times coverage, the big boys, because they were in Ferguson. I haven't seen any of that. Do you think the larger media, if there's not, as they say in the local media, if it bleeds, it leads?
Yeah.
Do you think they're interested in talking about these systemic issues of racism and poverty?
I don't. I think CNN, MSNBC, I guess they're the left. I would call them more centrist. And so
MSNBC, I'd call Republican these days.
Yeah, to the right of that, Mitt Romney kind of thing. And so I feel like what we call is protest porn. So there's no protest porn for them to send out. And so they can't have black folk getting beat up, people getting dragged and hogtied. It's not enough of that. It's strategic actions, people hopping out of cars, blocking highways, walking down freeways, banner drops in baseball games. It's more strategic. It's not as sexy with the real brutality, and so they shy away from it. It's almost like a Selma kind of moment. And so if there's no Bloody Sunday, no one talks about the voter registration and the freedom schools that happened in Loudoun counties before, but all you get is Bloody Sunday. You don't get the George Carver, Washington's, and all those project buildings and all those meetings that happen before the boycotts and boycotts that happen. So right now we're building that. Hopefully the local media or the national media comes. If not, we're still going to build a movement, and St. Louis is still going to be our Selma.
That's one thing that should be stressed, because it's not just a coordinated protest. You guys have been knocking on doors for voter registration, making sure former convicts know their rights and know that they could vote, doing community outreach. So it's like you said, it's not sexy, but it's actually strategic.
Yeah, and so, I feel like the movement as a whole, the movement for Black Lives, what we need is people to start as activists and protesters, and that's a good entry point. But we need more community organizers, so people that's willing to do this long, unsexy work. And so having civic engagement at a free breakfast program with youth and their parents can drive people to run for office. Also have people register to vote and actually vote and participate in democracy. Some people out of these programs have actually ran for school board, actually finished their degrees. And so some of these things that are not the sexy things, not tens of thousands of people walking in the street, actually gets real change. And we actually have a Ferguson protester that actually represents this district in John Collins Muhammad. And so we have to have that kind of change inside the system and out.
You're interesting. You haven't just been with Black Lives Matter here. You've been in other states. You've even been in other countries. So you've kind of seen the world. Talk about what should people know about St. Louis that's different than, when we think Baltimore or we think Ferguson or Cleveland or a lot of these places that have systemic racism. What makes St. Louis even more, whatever the word would be, tedious, egregious?
Unchecked. I would say unchecked. And so I would say that we really never had a civil rights movement. We never had a Reconstruction era. And so imagine a slave state never having a Reconstruction era. No one came to burn down the plantations. And so less than a mile, quarter of a mile from here, we have a large park in the blackest part of the city named after a slave owner. To the fact that we try to change the name of it, and there are black elected officials who won't even understand why we don't need a John O'Fallon named after O'Fallon Park. And so we have black people who are willing to sell out. We used to crack the joke all the time and say Harriet Tubman would come to the South, get the slaves, take them to freedom. On the way to freedom up north, she would drop off all the house Negroes in Missouri. And so this was the last stop for the sellouts. And so what we have is a great divide between people who would like to sell out, continue the status quo, or try to be on the other side with us, which is to make this city uncomfortable enough to actually transform and change itself. That's what's not happening.
People should also know, part of the problem is also black police officers. It's not just white officers. We've seen black officers kind of last night. The deputy chief over in Ferguson was kind of
Harold Billingsley, right. The most notorious house Negro police officer.
Boyd also, that's what they were.
You got Billingsley, who's just crazy. You got Boyd, who's just insane, right? He chases after black youth after school every day, to the point where people had to take him down through the projects to see if he would run through there. He wouldn't do that, and so he knows not to come into the hood. So these are black officers who are willing to go to the county and abuse some of these people. And so what we have is just a police state. And so we've had black people who said they were for us, like a Rochelle Gray, to go in, get high ranked, and forget about black people. You have the Billingsley who couldn't make it here, goes out to the county and becomes more abusive. So you have black ones, like a Billingsley, but then you have the notorious one like a Lakeshaw, like a Seaghost, who I would say the greatest dope dealer in the history of St. Louis. And so you could talk about anybody you want. You could talk about a Frank Lucas in Harlem, but you can't talk about that St. Louis because that's a Lakeshaw and Seaghost thing. And so we have unchecked racism and institutional power put into the police, and this is what we have, a crime-infested city.
And you look outside of St. Louis, too, in Missouri, is frankly pretty racist. Got the history. This was I believe it was a Union state, but technically part of the Confederacy anyway. So it's kind of like North Dakota. When I was there, when I was in North Dakota, you got one area with protesters and progressiveness, and then the rest of it is just like they're still kind of stuck in the 1940s and 50s.
So we got to understand that Missouri as a whole has two black cities, St. Louis and Kansas City. They're the blackest cities with over 50% of black population. They also make up over 70% of the state's GDP. So we are the economic engines, the blackest cities. Outside of these two black cities, which are the two largest cities, we're 88% white. And so when we talk about politics in Kansas City and Jackson County and St. Louis City, we can only be talking about local. And so you look at the Democratic Party, or the so-called Democratic Party, we have about 40 or so black on the state side, almost 15 on the state senate side, and so we don't have a majority. Even when a black person made a joke about assassinating Trump, which is not funny, but at the same time, it is what it is. She made a joke. Who stepped up to silence her? Gina Walsh, a Democrat in a black district. And so what you have is a facade of what a Democrat or the left is. And so we have no real power outside of the city. And so I think black people in Kansas City and St. Louis, if you look at a Jackson, Mississippi, down to our counterparts in the South and Birmingham, that you in a black city must control your local politics. You have to move it to the left, and you have to move it in a powerful way to have real change. Outside of these cities, outside of Birmingham and Jackson and Mississippi, Alabama, and Missouri, you have majority white people. You have Democrats who are really moderates. and then you have the right who were willing to kill us, not only with the gun but with the pen.
And on the Democratic side, you have senators like Claire McCaskill from here. They are very quick to get in front of a camera in D.C. to condemn Trump on his Charlottesville comments or on the Muslim ban or any of that stuff.
Yeah,
so
she wasn't in West Florissant. I couldn't see her though, and so I can't say I'm a Democrat. I can't say I'm a Republican, I'm black. And so I've never seen a Democrat or Republican represent me. Claire McCaskill definitely don't represent black people. Even Lacey Clay, to a large extent, he's living off the coattails of his father. And so when it's time to show up on West Florissant and Ferguson for a Mike Brown, for Kajeen Powell, for Kimberly King, you don't see a Lacey Clay, you don't see a Claire McCaskill, you don't see a Jason Kander, or none of those people. What you see is poor black people or representatives like Bruce Frank or John Collins Muhammad stepping up who are on the local level.
Yeah. Reverend Gray, a very well-spoken and active religious leader in the community, he was arrested, he was roughed up by police. Yeah. He calls this the new Selma. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, most definitely, this is Selma. And we got Bull O'Connor, we got Bull Connors, we got George Wallace. Definitely as our governor and Governor Greitens. We have a local, undercover white supremacists in Lyda Krewson. And so what we have is Democrat, Republican, Democrat, no matter how you look at it, no one will come into the defense and stand in the gaps for the poor black people in this city, even if we directly voted you in. And so that is the problem, is that we have to change the fundamental understanding of what politics does. And until then, we got to create a culture at the breakfast program so people can be knowledgeable of what that looks like.
You seeing enough support from white people? Because I've seen a lot of white people out at the protests. I certainly see in the comments and people sharing. What more can white people do? Because I've been all over covering Black Lives Matter, New York, Baltimore, elsewhere, and leaders in the movement say white people need to step up too.
Yeah, but I think that white people work has to be both and. So you can protest and march, and that's one part of it, but we have to look at the social economic impacts of it. And so if the white person who works at Purina can protest and march, but can't have that conversation at Purina or Nestle, then we're going to have a problem. The Cardinals talk about trying to be diverse and trying to get into the black community, but they had snipers on the top of the stadium in preparation for protesting. So Bill DeWitt and the rest of them can't have it both ways. We can talk about Augusta Bush and his Anheuser-Busch and their family. Where are the Bush family? Where is the DeWitts and the Cardinals? Where are the Purinas and the Shipworks? And Monsanto is here, one of the largest corporations in the world. They're silent. And so what does that mean to have corporations silent, white people who run it silent, but your workers, a small few, are actually standing up? Those are the white people who influence policy and legislation and the culture around public and private investment to change some of these indicators and around poverty and crime in our community.
You got anything, Ty?
No.
No? I think my last thing is, it's 30 days. Obviously, you're not going to give up your strategy.
100 to 300 days of direct action. We're going to keep, turn this city up and being disruptive and disturbed. We're not destroying no property. Those things happen. And when people had those comments, I always laugh to say, if we have a protest that lasts for 6 hours and is peaceful, and the next 3 hours the police become an antagonist and some windows break, what I can promise you is that a week before the non-guilty, there was no protest and there was no vandalism. And so maybe, just maybe, if they would give people justice, there would be no protesting blocking highways and commerce, and there damn sure be no broken windows.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you too.